If all the actors, both in the nation state space and the crimeware space, are using the same tooling, the same capabilities, the same, even in some cases, the same syntax in the commands they're running, makes it incredibly difficult to identify.
These types of attacks allow adversaries to go unnoticed, sometimes for long periods of time, by using compromised valid accounts.
Welcome to the Talos Threat Perspective for our Year in Review special, Part 1. I'm Hazel Burton. In these two dedicated episodes, we will peel back the layers of the threats that dominated 2024. And to help me do just that are two of the report's authors, Caitlin Huey and Kendall McKay, and Talos's Head of Outreach, Nick Biasini. You can download Talos's 2024 Year in Review now at blog.talosintelligence.com/2024 Year in Review. Let's dive in with part 1. Now, if there's one thing that last year's threat landscape showed us, it's that attackers don't always need cutting edge tools to be effective. In 2024, cybercriminals prioritized stealth and efficiency, often relying on well worn techniques rather than coming up with their own custom malware or dropping 0 days. So, why is that?
First and foremost, you have to realize that every time an actor performs an action, it creates an opportunity for detection. And by focusing on things like stealth, using simpler techniques, we dig into like living off the land binaries and using shared dual use tools. You doing that makes detection a lot more difficult, right? It makes it less opportunities for defenders to see. On top of that, it makes things like attribution a lot more difficult. If all the actors, both in the nation state space and the crimeware space, are using the same tooling, the same capabilities, the same, even in some cases, the same syntax in the commands they're running, makes it incredibly difficult to identify. And then finally, the use of 0 days. This is usually done only when it is absolutely needed to do so.
Yeah, I guess it's the opposite to the Sherlock Holmes theory. When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Whereas attackers work in reverse. When you've tried all the easy options, whatever remains must be the last resort. So, where does this leave defenders? How should they prioritize their defenses?
Patching has to remain a priority. So we saw in 2024 so many top targeted vulnerabilities that were very old, in some case, decades old. The second thing I think organizations need to focus on is making sure that their security products are configured properly. And a lot of the times, organizations will deploy security products right out of the box without really changing any of the configurations. And this can be problematic because often these products are set to audit only mode. So that means that the product will detect or alert on activity, but it won't block it. And then I think the third thing, um, organizations and users really need to be vigilant against identity based attacks. This was a theme we saw throughout 2024.
Let's stay on that identity theme because identity based attacks accounted for 60% of all Cisco Talos incident response cases last year.
I think the most common tactic we observed in the Talos IR engagements and dataset that we looked at was the use of valid accounts, typically seen in the initial access phase, where adversaries obtained and then abused credentials of existing accounts to carry out various phases of their operations. From this Talos IR data set, we found that half of all identity based attacks were related to ransomware and pre ransomware operations. Actors were also frequently motivated by their intent to sell stolen credentials for profit. These types of attacks allow adversaries to go unnoticed, sometimes for long periods of time, by using compromised valid accounts.
So, as you open the year in review, you'll find that the first section focuses on vulnerabilities, email threats, and adversary tooling. So, I picked a few pieces of data and analysis for this next section. And the first thing that we're going to talk about is the network device vulnerabilities that attackers most went after in 2024.
If an adversary does gain access to a device like this, it's really going to be pretty catastrophic for the organization. It was really interesting to look at the 2024 data because amongst the top targeted network devices, we saw many of these were actually end of life devices. So that means that the manufacturer is no longer supporting these devices, and that means that patches would not be available. Threat actors, they're going to scan for these vulnerabilities, and if they find them, they are going to go right after them and get, easy access to your organization.
Yeah, I mean, on the face of it, to people who don't work in these systems, it seems kind of obvious. End of life devices, unpatched systems, these are bad things. But as Nick will go into, it's a lot more nuanced than that. And this is why attackers are continuing to have some success here.
Defense is really, really hard. You only can patch the systems you're aware of. And far too often in organizations, you don't have a strong asset program to really understand every single asset that you need to defend. What version of operating system or software are they running on? What needs to be patched is a difficult conversation. And on top of that, you're working in a production environment where you're constantly having to fix issues. It is very common for an issue to pop up on a system, something have to be rolled back, and a patch be undone without necessarily the security team realizing this is happening.
Moving topic. And here is something that anyone who's ever received an email should probably know. The subject lines that cybercriminals are using to gain your attention, well, they're changing.
Yeah, threat actors are having success in using simple, overwhelmingly ordinary, common words that one would expect to see in their daily inbox. In the data that we looked at, we saw that threat actors largely abandoned the use of urgent or time sensitive subjects and kind of moved away to opting toward for terms that are far less sensational or likely to be mistaken as benign day to day messages.
The report contains a list of the most common words found in the subject headings of malicious emails, and they're words like forward, account, business, request, payment, everyday stuff. Sneaky. The next topic I want to explore is malicious tooling and living off the land binaries, lolbins. Well, threat actors used a lot of them last year.
So the easiest thing to think about this is most of these are tools that your sysadmins will make heavy use of. Think things like PowerShell, WMIC, but there are literally hundreds of executables that are on your Windows desktop or on your Mac or on your Linux operating system that can be used to do nefarious things. And this is what adversaries continue to use. Why am I going to download a utility to use as a loader to download malware when I can use a utility that's already on the box? Why am I going to download a utility to do scanning when I can build scanning into PowerShell and run commands via PowerShell? We see entire rats that are built in PowerShell now. We have ransomware that's effectively built in PowerShell.
So, a conundrum. If these tools are being utilized by threat actors, but you already have them in your system, what's the best way to go about spotting malicious use?
So, first and foremost, access control is your best friend. You do not need, everyone in your organization does not need the ability to run these utilities. Additionally, you need to make sure that you are logging these events and you're seeing what these commands look like. I will tell you, most of the time, when you're looking at a malicious PowerShell event, is going to look very different than when a sysadmin is running a PowerShell command. But the only way that you know that is if you're logging events and looking at those logs.
Moving on to ransomware. Now, this is a pretty meaty section in the report, so we're going to split this discussion in two and have the other half open the next episode. So, first of all, let's focus on the industries that were most heavily targeted by ransomware actors last year.
We've seen education and healthcare be two of the top targeted sectors just year over year. Those two sectors have a lot of similarities, but when we're looking specifically at education, there's a few things that come to mind that make this a particularly attractive industry for adversaries to target. And I think the first is insufficient funding. Often struggle to have enough funds to meet their educational requirements and needs, let alone a surplus of cash for things like cybersecurity budgets in this instance. And relatedly, there's often resourcing challenges associated with that. And then you look at the types of information that threat actors can get from compromising education entities, and it's really quite. It's really quite the gold mine. All of that personally identifiable information and beyond that threat actors can either use for their own purposes or sell on the dark web.
The thing is, as well, even if an organization does have security systems and tooling in place, one of the very first things that a ransomware actor will try and do is disable them.
because they're trying to do nefarious things. And by disabling an EDR, they're going to greatly increase their success. One of the most important things that organizations can do, though, is ensure that the uninstallation process is password protected. Almost every EDR provides the capability to you having to provide a password to uninstall it. Far too often, we see organizations not taking advantage of this. And in that case, all the adversary has to do is go to the system they have access to, uninstall the EDR solution, and it's gone off the box. They don't have to worry about it anymore. But if you password protect it, that puts an extra barrier in front of them.
That is all for part one. Remember, you can get your copy of Talos's year in review at blog.talosintelligence.com/2024 year in review. In part two, we'll be back with a look at the most prolific ransomware actors of last year. We'll also look at MFA abuse and AI based threats. And that episode will be available very shortly. In fact, it might well be there now, sitting in the year in review playlist on our YouTube channel. Thanks for watching and take care.